only genuine members in my life. Nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you.
And oh, that's really great. That's good little workings, yeah. We want those students are ready to do something. We need a cluster.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Hey, how you going? I'm just closing the door.
We don't need you.
I'm here.
Okay, now that Beth's here, why you said the way we Kate? How are we going, Kate?
Yesterday we had beastlings, today we have worldlings.
Oh yeah. Right on.
Okay, thank you very much everybody for coming. Welcome to the second seminar in our International Symposium on Objects, Knowledge Governance, Organisation Management through Objects. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome Tess Lea, an old friend, an old Darwin girl, born and bred in Darwin, young Darwin girl, and was at the university here for many years. In fact, the first time I think I ever sat down and talked to Tess was in this room, or just over there. And now she's at the University of Sydney, having been awarded an ARC QE2 fellowship, which has given her the opportunity to do some thinking and writing about objects in her world. And she's, I think, today sharing with us some of her stories and experiences of thinking about objects in her world in Darwin, and how to think about them through theoretical frameworks and where that's leading to. So we'll hand over to Tess, thank you. And
so the next slide is just, it's really nothing slide, but there you go. So just to put this into context, yes, I have this fellowship which was asking a very pragmatic question: can there be good policy in regional and remote Australia? And I sort of wanted to answer, after immersing this within it in various ways, with just no. But I don't think I can get away with that. So I've been gathering case studies from different sites, lots and lots of different sites, and the point of the different sites of doing things in a deliberately fragmented way was to interrupt what I see as a habit of policy analysis, which gives these coherent biographies to policy, as if that's actually how they ramify in everyday lives, how they unfurl in our everyday worlds, whereas in fact they don't. No one actually encounters a policy coherently. You don't ever kind of confront a person called policy, and you don't inhabit a thing coherently that is now you being welfare or you dependent, or with the possible exception of being a student. But even then, there are a whole lot of other things beside. So in order to try and interrupt the habit of analysis, which requires that we give coherence to policy even through description, I tried to mess things up. And the bad part of that, methodologically, is I ended up with a bit of a mess, which after this piece of work that I'm going to talk about today, I have to go back to. So in some senses, what I'm talking about today is an escape from my own mess. From other points of view, though, it's very much part of it. Because the second part of the set of questions that I'm asking is, having immersed in policy worlds and the messiness of policy worlds, what do you do? How do you describe them? How do you describe them so that you do justice to how they are unfurling and how they are lived in a way that still keeps people reading or listening or seeing what you come up with? Because the potential for alienating lots of different audiences through esoterica are great. The moment you complicate the analysis by saying, well, it's not really as coherent and as neat and da-da-da as these evaluative frameworks would have us believe, now I'm going to try and represent something that's a lot more fragmented, but I'm going to try and do that in a way that keeps people with me. You encounter a whole lot of others, highly related issues of I guess, representation in quotes. So I've been doing these experiments in representation, and to that end, I've been part of the background on some film work with Prof in the Caribbean Indigenous Corporation, and I've created essays that are illustrated with political cartoons, say, or now I'm working on a book on Darwin. And in this book, I'm experimenting with modes of doing theory in ways which remain hopefully enjoyable and readable for non-academic audience. And I don't say that with any sense that that's a straightforward undertaking. And nor do I think it's just a matter of the writing. You know, you don't just solve the problem of writing through sexing it up somehow, shortening sentences, which is one option, I guess, but that's not really, it's not quite the order of issue, the problem. So I do consider that this book is part of my fellowship outputs, even though it's not drawing on the same ethnographic case studies. Now, to explain the book, the Darwin book is part of a series that's been commissioned by New South Press. It's the brainchild of Philippa McGuinness, who's an editor with them, who realised that there wasn't anything that you could go to which covered all of the Australian capital cities in one hit from a writerly perspective. So she got a whole lot of writers in the main, the odd academic snuck in there, to take on the task of representing their home cities. Darwin's the last cab off the rank. So Perth is finished and it's going to be out next. Done. The only exception to the capitals is there was one commissioned on Alice Springs. To confess, I have read none of them. First, I read none of them because I thought I would be intimidated and frozen, and I'm avoiding looking at Beth, but she knows how bad I am in confronting my own writing. So, the demon of writing. So, I thought, no, I'm not going to be, just wowed and awestruck by what other people have done and therefore silent in front of the computer. I will just plough in and try and find my own voice. And about 60% committed in, I thought, okay, now's the time I can look. I opened them up and I thought, oh my God, I've done something so different that I started having panic attacks of a different kind. So I still haven't really read them. I will. I've got them. They loom at me, they stare at me, but I can't come to grips with them because I'm still in the writing process. Now, I'm using my experiences as a born and bred Darwinite, a rare thing, you can touch me on the way out, to frame an exploration of this still very frontier town from multiple angles, using an approach which I guess, the closest would be a thing called ficto-criticism, although it's not quite it either. And that ficto-criticism is a mode of writing which aims to avoid dry academic genres by experimenting with modes of writing that remain nonetheless true to people's experiences. I've discovered along the way that once you take out, those of us who are experimenting with writing are also in the habit of complaining about the constraints of social scientific writing. What it forces you to do, the postures of realism, and we're excited with the excuse to kind of be a bit more literary. However, I've discovered there are some benefits and advantages to that social scientific framing, and one of the big benefits and advantages is you get to do a bit of exegesis, then you get to do a bit of signposting, as in this, drawing on so-and-so, I aim to such and such. So you can kind of set your reader up for what is to come. But when you're denied that, because you're working to a short word limit and you're talking to people who might not necessarily think rat's us, you also have to try and just let the words do the work. And that does take it into another, I have found that quite something. So I'm going to read some bits of what I've done to show you the struggle, where I feel that every now and again I step into this ponderous kind of dictatorial voice. I'm telling people what they need to think rather than letting the writing, the description do the work of analysis. Take people there so they can interpret as they want. la. So I'm deliberately sharing something that I struggle with. And because Darwin is itself a place that is, I believe, completely founded on modes of being which require strategic myopia all the time in all sorts of different ways, I've tried to think of ways to interrupt that. How do you get people to think about things that they are very practiced of not thinking about, and not have them slam the book down or hate you? I don't really care if they hate me, but I don't want them to slam the book down. So how do you keep tickling the belly, but also show some things? So I have very deliberately complicated myself in a lot of what I describe. So there isn't a distant authorial voice. That's of course done in other things. It's showing I was born here, so don't try and discredit me. I speak with greater authority than you do. Blah, blah, blah. There's that kind of machismo. But there's also a technique of I'm trying to be disarming at the same time. I'm trying to be disarming with some of the critical things that I've got to say. So if I say that the town's ugly, I can get away with it. Okay, so I was going to bring in to show you one of my competitor, I had this idea yesterday, man, my competitor representational forms. Here it is in the absence, but actually it's sold out. So there's this magazine, bastards. There's a magazine called Resident. Have you seen it? Yeah. It's in all the hotels. And it's very glossy. Very beautiful. It's almost, it shows a side to the territory which is, almost unrecognisable. It's so airbrushed. And in the latest edition, there is a section which is reflecting on the history of the Northern Territory, written by my good mates, I don't even know them, Peter and Sheila Forrest. And it's astonishing. So I'll come back to that. I wanted to show it to you. I wanted to show how they represent the very same thing that I'm going to be talking about, but I can't show you. But have a look at it. The latest edition of Resident, and how irritating that they're sold out in the two places that I managed to rush to today to try and find them. So I'm going to dash through some history and then I'm going to get to some of the writing. So to set up bits of the writing, when you're probably aware of a lot of this stuff. Okay, so South Australia used to own the Northern Territory, and when it did own the Northern Territory, it was a bit of a financial disaster. So they sold it off, to speculators and were hoping to make a lot of money, and they didn't. So they this is from 1900, where they were already starting to say, "Oh my God, this is hell on a stick." But before they got rid of it and handed it over to the Commonwealth, and there was a deal done, there was a sale, so the Commonwealth bought it. They weren't sort of just passive while they were here, so it was actually a very violent period. This was, in many senses, the killing times. Now, the reason I'm interested in that is because it introduces also cattle, who are here right from the beginning. Massive pastoral boom across the top half of the Northern Territory was triggered by these very favourable reports by the cartographers who were coming through and saying, "Yep, this would make great grazing country, this would be and this, bound to be water here," and that. So based on those reports, there are all these attempts to kind of send cattle north, but not just cattle. There were sheep attempted, all sorts of different kind of crops attempted, They were racing to do it because the South Australian governments had sold these things on the basis that within 3 years you will stock your, so I give you a bit of land and within 3 years you've got to make a buy. So they were sort of racing to do these land grabs and to get them, stocked and making profit as soon as they possibly could. Now, given that they only had 3 years to comply with the minimum stocking rates and only 3 years to clear the land of its competitors, in that period, those competitors, Aboriginal families, all various kinds of flora and fauna, and they were grouped together, wholesale pastoral settlement pretty much required wholesale emptying, and it was a bit of a zero-sum equation. That's not the story that you get in the forest's representation in Resident. So Resident tells you during this period, pastoralism moved north. That's probably, I think that's almost a direct quote. Little's recorded, of course, about what Larrakia thought and other groups thought or said amongst themselves about what these new interlopers were about or up to. What did they make of these people who protected their rights to stolen property with guns and jails for want of a reciprocal system of asking and getting? Matching the colonisers as masters of understatement, the terms that are used, the sudden violent frontier is remembered in Aboriginal English variously as the killing times, the quietening time and station times. And between the killings we know there are lots of robbings and humiliations and rapes and jailings, and there was gambling, and now I'm going to start reading, and trade in alcohol at the back of pubs and down alleyways, and there was sex, so many men, so few women. Segregation, so rigidly observed in some places, was observed in the breach in others. Compassion and intimacy leavened the hostility. The wonder of it is, out of all of this, comes the old families of Darwin and their deep friendships across racial lines. Lovers stayed together in defiance of written and tacit laws. Families became interrelated, many proudly so. And out on the sports field, teams formed which respected speed, agility, marksmanship, group work, regardless of ethnic identity or class allegiance. Yet nostalgia about these bonds is also how Darwinites make themselves innocent of the town's dormant divisions. Okay. La la la. Along with the tried and failed tobacco, breadfruit, rice and sugarcane crops, sheep and cattle herds were attempted. Sheep runs followed John McDowell Stewart's epic inland route, but the sheep died. Like cooked bones in a dog's gut, speargrass seeds pierced the sheep's bowel linings. The sheep starved during droughts, they ate poisonous plants. The lambs suffered heat stress in the wet and died. The ewes were in too poor condition to suckle during the dry. There were no animal liberation protesters around to deplore the prolonged and painful endings. Instead, like so many temperate enterprise dreams for the top-end monsoon country, then and now, the desire to have sheep stations took a long time to be defeated. They were still being attempted when I was a little girl, out at Berrimah on Darwin's Fringe. The CSIRO's scrawny, diseased-looking flocks predicted the CDU T-shirts, created by postgraduate students at Charles Darwin University in 2003, lampooning the institution's name change from Northern Territory University, NTU, to its new acronym, CDU. Does anyone remember that? Yeah. I tried to get my hands on one, but I couldn't. And then buffalo cow, blah, blah, blah. Cattle fare better. And this is when they fixed the image of the rugged stockman as the icon of the northern frontier, despite these retching cycles of boom and bust, which pretty much ended up seeing most of the Northern Territory divided into very few hands, the hands of the cattle barons, the robber barons, if you like. First Bovril and then Vesties. I'll just whip through this. The Northern Territory also, of course, generates the White Australia policy because of all that breeding and the Chinese are going to overrun the rest of Australia. Keep going. When we come to the cattle. Water buffalo. Extra. Come in and they create, read my book, they create more swamps that break down the natural little barriers, so malaria becomes even more of a problem. And then we have these guys. Okay, so here. So, I want to talk about these guys for just a bit. In 1914, Bovril's North Australian holdings were the largest in the British Empire. They were eclipsed by the Union Cold Storage Company, aka the Vesty brothers, who, with their purchase of Wave Hill Station next to the Bovril holdings in Victoria River Downs, southwest of Darwin, and their estates elsewhere in Australia and Argentina, became the largest meat company in the world. The cattle kings were as important to the financing of global capital as mining conglomerates are today. Their cattle as good as armed tanks for taking land. They also stunted the north for decades, with Aborigines at the lethal end of a very long exploitation line. So it's not just Aboriginal people who suffer during this period. So these guys pretty much come in there aggressively, They own that ship, by the way. Yeah, anyway, they aggressively buy out their competitors to dominate world trade. They displace them from the market, they avoid taxes worldwide, and like dealers in illicit goods, they disguise the ownership of their companies in very dense financial tributaries. And obviously, the book on Darwin, I can't go into that too much, but it's quite fascinating. It was the rabbit burrow I went down very early on. They were the first to take advantage of new refrigeration technologies to freight perishable food across large distances. They owned the cold storage facilities, the shipping lines, the wholesale and the retail outlets, down to the level of the butcher. And this is across a global big supply chain at a point in time where world wars were happening. They were making money. So when you hear, get this point, when you hear a little story about Darwin, that the Unionists were responsible for shutting down Vestey's network in Darwin, just remember, we're talking about the equivalent of BHP Billiton reacting to da-da-da. And if they were pulling out of Darwin, they had business reasons to do so. It wasn't some pissant worker dispute, right? So they could pull out, they did pull out, and they pulled out within 4 years of having the meatworks in Darwin. So from go to work. They were pretty much the pioneers of today's global tax avoidance industry, and they were ecological vandals to boot. So those are our guys. Now, throwing open the Northern Territory to the Vestey and Bovril empires did little for animal husbandry or station improvement. They did not invest in their holdings beyond the crudest of measures, but degraded the best of the cattle country at microscopic rentals, paid little to no tax on their profits, and benefited from Aboriginal slave labour. And every administrator that comes into town thinks this is a good idea because it's a good use of this surplus, peoples. It's going to stop them from, degenerating into drugs and drink. So, just, I guess, could note the pattern. And through mythologisation and boosterism continuing to this day via very provincial historians named Forrests amongst others, the cattle barons are able to represent their interests all this time as aligned with the public at large. Okay. I went to Darwin High School, which people might know is built at Bullocky Point. And Bullocky Point was Vestey's meatworks back in the day.
Which one's you?
Yeah. And which one?
Yeah.
And the short
I
hair.
had short hair. Yeah, this guy runs the rehab at Darwin Hospital today. Yeah.
So that's over by, that's Darwin High there.
That's now Darwin High School. That's Vestey's. Okay. Yeah, that was when it was
But it
Vestey's
was the
meatworks.
Vestey's meatworks.
Yeah, exactly. So they had their worker village there. So people that weren't compounded in Calm Compound were also compounded here. And this also, in later chapters I'll talk about this also creates the first of the football clubs. The first of the Elsie Wills clubs comes out of here and becomes the coloured team, and that becomes Buffalo Football Club, which is a great story. And also becomes the genesis, the people from there, from that football club, go on to fight for the referendum. So it's the McGuinness family and whatnot. So we've got some things to be really proud of here. Anyway, so I went to this place, which is a very Gulag-style building that's there now, but at the time that it was built in the 1960s, it was state-of-the-art, seen as, very, really gorgeous thing. It's actually got the spectacular views that are impossible to see because of the way it's aligned and da-da-da-da. Anyway, it's built on that exact site. Now, it would have been la-la-la. All right, stop all that. Move on. I'm going to talk about this guy. So, that's kind of a backdrop to the story I really want to tell you today. I'm going to talk about my father now. So, leaving Darwin, as young people in the mid-1950s had to do to complete their secondary education, my father was sent to live with relatives in Sydney. He excelled at mathematics, enough to win a civil engineering scholarship at the University of Sydney. But with no home desk to study at, long commutes, the youthful distractions of playing pool and drinking beer, the pain of working class self-consciousness within an elite institution, and bronchial infections that saw him coughing blood at the start of each confronting day, he gave university away 6 months into his study. His idea of what civil engineering would be like and what its study proved to be in practice did not match. Freedom as a Northern Territory bushman beckoned. In 1953, as a still green drover, Bill, my dad, was hired as part of a team to muster 1,200 head of stock, shifting them from Coolabah Station in the Victoria River Downs, remember that's Bovril country, across the swollen floodplains of the Barkly Tablelands to Delmore Downs, over 700 miles away. The team had been contracted by Delmore's leaseholders, a subsidiary of the Tom Piper Food Company, which had bought Delmore as a virgin block with no cattle. The company had advanced £12,500 to Leslie John Kenner to help him buy Coolabah Station. Kenner's debt was to be paid by way of 8,000 cattle from his station to theirs, to be delivered over several years. Several shipments had already been made. Only 2 more years were required to clear the debt. In a separate deal, Kenner's station manager, one Hugh Wason Byers, would become an equal partner in Coolabah Station once the debt was extinguished. Wason was thus keen to settle the account, but he and Kenner had signed themselves up to a tight deal of delivering stock that they didn't really have. The droving was hard. A mixed herd of over 1,200 head had been mustered for the partial repayment. Clean skins and branded cattle, bullocks and cows all in together. The riders needed to work in shifts day and night, circling the herds to keep birthing cows from breaking out and arouse bulls from breaking in. With droving, you have horses that can do night watches and others for the day. It was us people who did the double shifts. That droving trip, I was on a horse 17 hours a day and sometimes more for 5.5 months. Whenever a cow gave birth, the calf was immediately killed and the mother forced back into the herd, for grief would bind her to the death side. The drovers would use the surge of the herd to force her from the great reach and loss of her newborn. Did you eat them? I asked naively. No, they're rubbish. No flesh, all bones. You just hit them on the head and worry about the cow. It was the end of the wet and the rivers were still high. The wild cattle resist the rising waters and throw their heads back, straining their eyes and stamping their hooves in terror. They have to be forced across fast waters. The rivers turn the black soil country of the Barkly into glutinous mud. The horses get swamp cancer, an ulcerous fungal infection that thrives in heat and humidity. Cattle break their legs in unseen potholes. We lost one horse in the big swollen rivers, lost our sugar and salt that way too. That whole country is full of rivers. Salt's your fridge. When you kill a bullock, most of it is salt and dry. I had a rifle, which the cook lost in that bloody river too. We had no way of keeping the meat, and we no longer had a gun to shoot. So we had to throw an animal every day and stick a knife in the back of its neck. We killed one every day. I got fat eating the kidneys. No one else liked them, so I ate a lot myself, all full of fat. Bill smacks his lips with memory. Any time the rain let up, the men tried to air their swags, flicking out accumulating maggots, breeding in the dank pockets of sweat and lukewarm animal blood. They were moving the mixed herd from Coolabah Station down through Skull Creek. A deep killing poison pulses through this backcountry. Skull Creek got its name after the Barrow Creek massacre of 1874, when up to 19 Kaya men, women and children were murdered, their skulls left to bleach in the desert sun. It was the police station manager from Barrow Creek who led the posse for the Coniston massacre in 1928, officially the last sanctioned slaughter of Aborigines in Australia. And in 2001, Barrow Creek saw the murder of tourist Peter Falconio and the abduction of his girlfriend Joanna Lees, a young tourist bewitched by the sweet curves of a seemingly broken down combi van, the murderer tucked inside. As they approached a rendezvous point for a scheduled stock inspection not that far out from VRD station, the head drover, Billy Ellis, leant back in his saddle, nodded his chin forward. A Spartan prophecy. There'll be trouble up ahead. Ellis knew some of the cattle that they were droning had been rebranded and that the clean skins were very recently marked. Bovril station manager, sent to inspect the shipment, noticed too. They kept driving, everything intact, all the way to Anthony Lagoon, where the coppers showed up again. The police corralled 104 head, shooting and killing these cattle to use in evidence, throwing the hides over a fence to dry. Since Byers had stolen cattle back, VRD's well-known Bull's Head cattle brand had been covered with Coolabah's hand brands, using solid blocks rather than an outline to disguise the original marks. Block brands not only disguise cattle duffing, they can burn the cattle so severely their skin peels away in cruel patches. That's one way duffing can be seen. Paste also shares secrets. Sometimes the rebranding had been done so hurriedly the tips of the two horns still showed. Byers was a cold man, renowned in a country inured to racial terror, as particularly brutal with blacks. The filmmakers Charles and Elsa Chauvel had used Coolabah Station to film parts of the movie Jeddah, the first full-length colour feature film to use Aboriginal actors made in Australia. They had even found a bit part for Hugh Wason Byers to play, as head drover. As the son of a grazier turned light horseman... Oh, sorry, keep going back. So, for Charles Chauvel, Wason Byers was a legendary horseman, playing himself. And, okay. He was as the son of a grazier turned light horseman, Humphrey McCrean notes, Charles Chauvel himself had a personal commitment to the settlement tradition of tough men sticking by their mates at pioneering or at war. But to his wife and fellow producer Elsa, their talent was a bully and at times rather sadistic. Byers, she would write, was a rough-hewn man, moody and aggressive, who used to delight in giving me the horrors at the dinner table. He would glare at me, and his great monster of a clenched fist would come down with a crash on the rough wooden table like an exploding bomb, lifting the knives and forks a foot high and scattering them. The tough man liked to use his whip and his gun to teach his lessons. He told a story in Pearl Ogden how he hated the sound of the didgeridoo, going from morning to night. When one bugger knocks up, another will take it on, he complained. Whistling, yelling, cracking whip, even blasting with gun did nothing to shut the songman up. He tried a new tactic. So this bloke, this Congal, I said, "Did you play that didgeridoo last night?" And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "All right, you bring him one down." I said, "You get up on that pole, that post in the yard, and you play that didgeridoo." And every time he stopped playing, I'd fire a shot at him. Well, he kept playing that didgeridoo, playing all day. I never heard a bloody didgeridoo for months after. Wason laughs, Ogden right, as he tells us. Shall I stop there? I can keep going about what happens next. No, I might actually stop it. I might stop it. So, I will go on. One of the things... Oh, no, let me just read you this last little bit about him. Except I've gone and not put my things into it. Just give me a chance here. No, sorry, I've got it all a bit mixed up. But what happens next is, what I try to do is link what's happening here to some other themes that I've got going in the book. And some of the other themes that I've got going in the book are that the big forces that affect this place are geological, ecological, environmental. There are obvious things to say. There are also racial, it's an obvious thing to say. But we're also driven by US military policy, which is possibly only just coming to light to people's consciousness now, but it comes to light in this history too. So another person who really likes Hugh Wason Byers is this dude, an American freelancing journalist called Edgar Lea, who was travelling with the team of pretty much US and Australian soldiers who were rapidly building the Stewart Highway during the 1940s because they needed to, during 1940s, sorry, 1940s, because they needed to get soldiers and soldier equipment to the north in quick, smart time. So the Stewart Highway had been left languishing for years and years and years, like almost, 100 years. It was just extraordinary. These guys do it in one season, so they're working really, really hard. This journalist travels with them, he thinks they're amazing, and along the way, they're stopping, of course, all the water holes. Point about, whose water holes might these be, and they share bread, and they share stories. And the guy who stands out as being the kind of most impressive of all the cattlemen is Hugh Wason Byers. So Edgar Lather is in fact an incredibly respected journalist, and he writes a book prophesying that Japan will invade Darwin. He's ignored, but he had spent years in Japan, could speak fluent Japanese, and was reading their military strategy. So his paper predicting this stuff gets published in the New York, the Weekend in New York, something or other, Saturday Evening Post, 1 week before Darwin gets annihilated. So he's So he's falling in love with Hugh Wason Byers too. I keep going on about Hugh Wason Byers, la la la, how nasty he was. It's some of the stories that sit around about this guy. So what happens with the arrest? I'll return to that. I'll return to Bill's voice. Wason wasn't at the cattle ducking trial, but we heard later that he got word to the blackfellas that if they dogged him in, he would do them. He got off, but he lost that station eventually and drank rum and told stories. See that book? That one he reckons he's the real Crocodile Dundee? Tom Coles, Hell West and Crooked. He goes into it. I don't need to read the story filtered through ripping yarns of retired bushmen and softened terms for the pastoral killing fields. The story Bill Lee tells me seems incredible, but the always partial archives bear him out. Sorry, skip forward. This is, you can find out about Hugh Wason Byers, just do a little search and all sorts of things pop up, including that he's one of our true Anzacs. So keep going. This is Edgar Lather, who writes his book, The March of Japan, and admires Hugh. And here we go. There's a heap on this. There always partial archives bearing him out. It was the biggest case of alleged cattle rustling set to trial in the Northern Territory. It was heard by a Supreme Court judge, Martin Crewald. The journalist Douglas Lockwood covered the trial, and it was reported across the country. Byers was charged with 10 counts of stealing 90 head of oxen, cows, heifers and calves. The court was held on the veranda of Anthony's Lagoon Police Station, over 43 degrees Celsius in the shade, over a long, hot week. Judge Crewald sat in red fur-fringed robes and wool rig in blistering heat. Ringers, head stockmen and drovers sat in the gallery. Three Aboriginal station hands from Coolabah, named Duncan, Hector and Bloomer, gave evidence. Even the cattle, who had performed so well for Jeddah's station scenes, were made to testify. The Crown prosecutor showed the inverted hides from the slaughtered beasts, the original VRD burns, clear for all to see. As for Byers, he was defended by a silk, flown in by light aircraft, which was a big deal, all the way from Adelaide. There were several ways that this flash QC could discredit the Aboriginal witnesses. He chose the uniformity of their testimony. With theatrical gestures, he turned to the gallery every now and again, appealing to their casually shared ethnocentrism, as he press-ganged Duncan and Bloomer into admitting perhaps they'd not seen so much after all. Could it be they were simply repeating learnt lines? Byers was fully acquitted. I think of this trial now and how it might proceed today. It is not the travelling magistrates' courts and the haphazard use of translators that comes to mind, nor is it the attempts to have Aboriginal customary justice recognised within the property scripts known as Australian law. Instead, I think of the cattle and the under-resourced officers of the Northern Territory Ombudsman. Carolyn Richards came into her role as Ombudsman in mid-2005 and was replaced by the incoming Country Liberal Party in late 2012. As Ombudsman, she inquired into the place received about the condition of the Brahman cattle at Mataranka Station, owned and managed by Charles Darwin University, and used for training students who wanted to work on the land. Sometime between about August and December 2009, an estimated 800 cattle and horses died or were put down because of malnutrition and lack of water. Inspectors found tick-infested livestock with bones jagging their hides, some so sick meat ants were killing them where they stood. Toby Goringe, a university vocational trainer, complained all the way up the line, all the way to the Ombudsman. She wrote a report recommending prosecution, but no one was charged. With the assistance of government foot dragging, the small 12-month window for bringing a charge under the Animal Welfare Act had expired. Should there be any mistaking Darwin's ongoing kinship with the fortunes of the cattle industry and the land that was taken, consider the impact of another truth-telling woman, Lea White. This former policewoman turned animal activist had smuggled graphic footage of Australian cattle being tormented in an Indonesian abattoir. Their eyes gouged and bodies slashed with blunt knives. Reporters from the Australian Broadcasting Commission's Four Corners program investigated for themselves. The initially low rating, like one of their lowest rating shows called A Bloody Business, became one of the biggest media stories of 2011. Four Corners' expose unleashed such a furious public reaction that the Australian government also reacted by placing an immediate ban on exporting live cattle to Indonesia. Driving from Darwin to Sydney to take up a new job, as it turns out, in June 2011, camping in outback stations, country towns along the way, the late autumn roads were gloriously empty of tourists. But joining me on the journey south were long lines of cattle trucks, the vehicles that had killed off the drovers and created a new breed of long-distance herder, the trucking, carrying loads of exhausted, frightened cattle. They were all heading in the wrong direction. It was a reversal too of Baz Luhrmann's epic film Australia, where getting the fat, cheeky cattle onto big metal ships in Darwin drove the plot. The live export protests zeroed in on Indonesian killing techniques. Good abattoir practice, it was insisted, sees cattle stunned before they are knifed. Yet with Indonesian practices positioned as inhumane, Australians saw the houses with false heap elevated. The intensive farming practices that allow Australians to enjoy cheap meat were left unframed. Stunning makes an animal easier to handle, reducing its struggle, stopping cattle from manifesting the distress that proved so disturbing for Australian viewers. Cattle breeder and fourth-generation Darwinite Lawrence Artoy gives me a similar reason for why buffalo are not exported live since the live export ban, despite the clear Asian preference for their meat. A stunning gun able to penetrate the buffalo's thicker skull has not yet been invented. Moreover, buffalo will stand and face a stockman or a dog, rather than retreat into flight mode, as cattle do. And while buffalo can be trained to perform circus-type acts, they prefer being worked quietly, with a less confrontational approach. You have to know them. Nor do they like being crowded in confined spaces, they resist it. All this makes them less popular along all the nodes of the export industry, from trucking and shipping and on to slaughter. Buffaloes more readily collapse the idea of humane killing into its oxymoron. So cattle, docility and stupefaction are preferred, among other things, to make what is happening more appealing to the humans involved. Could this be a metaphor for Darwin's cultural and economic foundations? Not as the romantic pageant imagined by Baz Luhrmann, a panorama of mystical Aborigines, untamed outback men and pretty English damsels, but this insistence on remaining in a state of numbed indifference and ignorance to that which we do not want to know. In neo-colonial settings like Darwin, forgetting is a necessary kind of cultural habit, a social amnesia that helps the town cohere. It's the rough and fancy coinciding together that newcomers note, like watching the fabulous sunset at Mindle Beach markets to the raw sounds of a drunken feud. To live in a place where life does not stay sanitised for too long, where fantasies of urbane sophistication demolish under the glare of everyday realities, Darwinites learn to hover between knowing and ignoring. It makes them less easy with making categorical distinctions between good and bad ethnicity or right and wrong animal deaths. It's a place which insists on mixing things up. Now, I want to talk about the problems of this, but I'm not sure what my timing is. Okay, you're not really my chair, you're my chair. So can I just go through what I think the problems with this are?
Yeah.
So what I think the problems with this are is that whole end section is me. This is me wanting to philosophise about, the complete paradox of being deliciously upset about stuff happening in Indonesian abattoirs and completely non-mindful of what's happening in our everyday back here in Australia, where you're not even allowed to get into the slaughterhouses and where the demise of one industry, the shutting down of one trade, one live export trade, just about shut down the industry, and questions of viability are still not asked. So this is my politics coming in, really slamming in. No longer a story about Darwin, but me wanting to moralise, So this is, I find, why I chose this section to talk to you about, is that I find the struggle of switching tones in this book, where you're trying to create yarns to carry people along in a story of, how did this place come together and what was some of its histories and how do you make the familiar a little bit unfamiliar, so it jags just a bit so you don't slide past it so quickly, and yet deny or try and suppress or shut down that voice which wants to kind of sociologise and preach with. So that's, I'm finding, is the struggle of this book. And this book, when I first got it, I thought, how great, I don't have to be that academic person, but in fact being that academic person is an impossible thing to do. How does this relate to government? So I would say that all of this is a story of how the place is governed, and including what are the things that are in the invisibilities. And some of the things that I'm threading through here are themes throughout the book. So the military history is a definite one. How do we get our infrastructure and who pays for it, and what are the histories that sort of palimpsest underneath this? Are some of the stories too, and even trying to give a little bit of sentience to the non-human world is clearly a theoretical intervention, which I'm not pointing to and saying, here, look at this, I'm drawing on so-and-so to be such and such, but I'm just trying to do it.
Okay, thanks, Tess. Who's got some questions or comments to open up the discussion?
I have to go and teach, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm absolutely breathless. It has taken me on a journey. I just don't think I will ever forget. I probably have to buy the book. It was extraordinary, and the connection with the abattoirs in Indonesia was just basically filling the gaps. Because what you help us is actually take the story further, rather than just leave it there in the 19th century.
Historical.
Yes, and put it all together. It's not finished there, it just goes on. So what I'm saying, the history is also today. So the references we have today, they got enriched by covering those, by linking those places in time.
That's the way you say it works.
I'm absolutely astonished. I would have never bought the book. I sat here and I was thinking, this is not for me, but thank you very much.
That's a good answer.
It is, yeah. Get her on the back of the book.
I was really interested in, I don't know whether you use the word haranguing writing, but I've been thinking about it a bit myself in a project that I've been writing about around pathways and teacher training in home communities. And I've started to use the terminology that I've used before around the white public space of schooling, and your talk prompted me to think about how I use it almost as a swear word in the report, and how I, on the one hand, have been encouraged to be very upfront about that, and on the other, maybe I use it a bit too much.
Right.
And how to take people along.
I find it's a political challenge, it's an ethical challenge, It's a writing challenge, obviously, it's an analytical challenge. And I think it's something, the reason I wanted to share it, apart from the fact, just to be really honest, I can't interrupt writing at the moment, so I can't, sort of say, let me step out and talk about something else right now, because there's a deadline looming. Apart from that, the reason why I just thought, well, this is something that we probably share. I think a lot of scholars are coming to the view of how do we do work that does work. And I have my own allergic reaction. I really loved that notion that Helen gave us of being allergic to the prescription for being policy accessible, which is to really reduce your work to these dot points. I think that's nonsense. Why would you go through years of your life trying to gather information when what you're doing is chucking it all away and you're taking away its stories? So how do we then keep stories and keep people going? But I have found there's this, a voice that keeps wanting to come in and bash it through.
Well, can I jump in on that? Because it seems to me, knowing a little more about all the things that are in the book, but even in what you did here, it's like, okay, global cattle industry. So, and I don't know anything about, I don't even know what that stuff in that jar was. Was that goo or? What is that? Is it for your? Is it Vegemite or is it for your shoes?
Beef tea.
Oh, beef tea. Okay, I didn't know if it was shoe polish or it was like.
They smear it on bread. It's a means of getting
that's fine.
salted
Better than
protein.
smear it on your shoe. That's what I.
You're off shooting zoos. You can have your salted protein.
Yeah. So it's like cool. Like, how do you in stories move people along with the background of a certain perspective on history of global capital, which, the big literature around was the kind of capital linkages and financial and trade formations during the 40s and 30s, the same as now, without saying they became global. Well, they were global, but perhaps the modes of production were different. Okay. So I think that's really cool, and you can just show it through these stories that build, and now we're in, we have a certain kind of defense formation, now we have another kind of defense formation, and how do we see the relationship between these two? But I don't know why, so I think it's cool, and the more we would have heard, the more we would have seen that, versus you telling us that, this kind of second order telling. But I don't know why you have such a allergy to demoralizing at the end, because I just think, why not? Like, okay, so why not? I mean, I'd say why not? Think about, like, we were shooting. There's a film that we've been working on, but we were shooting pickup scenes, and it's a film with old friends of mine, indigenous friends of mine. We're in the harbor. Where are we? We're in Darwin. So we're at Mindoro, and we're in the harbor, and we're on a boat, and the idea is that here's this little dinghy with an Aboriginal group in it, tearing back from Anson Bay, trying to get back to Darwin in time to get the missing house person to the public housing before the housing inspectors come back.
Who's me, Barbara?
Who's you? That's Tess, by the way. And what we wanted was a big frame to say how big the ocean is, how small the dinghy is. And just because it's Darwin Harbor, what was going by were these huge tankers. There were military ships going by, and there's huge tankers going by. And so I'm in the other boat crashing along, and I'm telling my cinematographer, get the fucking big boat in. And I'm saying, drive by the fucking big boat. Now, that's me saying something, right? It's saying big tanker.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not overlying it by saying, and the big tanker is global capital. But it's still making the point that there are these scales of governmentality and scales of theft and scales of appropriation, and here are how these scales ramify from like export mining to the people who have been expropriated from the landscape and have to deal with this.
Yeah, coexisting right now, not past tense.
Yeah, but I guess that's what you want to do with in a narrative, but I don't mind every once in a while one of the, if we're telling the story and someone says something, to pull that argument into the foreground a little bit.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's just an issue of foreground. I didn't hear anything in that ending that seemed demoralizing or anything. Just like I heard Manhattan. I thought that's why Darwin's like Manhattan. Because you have that same like doubleness all the time, in which you can't function all the fabulous, and it can't function if at once in the same time you're not able to walk over people who are constantly homeless and constantly, shooting up and down on the street.
Do you think the...
So I didn't hear the moral.
Okay.
Do you think the as yet unread other stories of the other cities are in fact acting in their own way as objects of governments that is making you think, oh my God, the more I give my own story and the more political it is, the greater I'm going against that grain?
The other ones.
Yeah, the other ones.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I think that's partly it, because the beginning of this, it starts with just literally the roof coming off, and nails flinging out into the sky during the cyclone. Remember this bracketing going on? Anyway, because my idea was that you have the roar of the cyclone at the beginning, and you have the roar of the fighter jets as my bookends. These are my bookends for the whole book. And so it's a very dramatic beginning of, watching the world being tossed above your head in this vortex. And I open the other books and, one spends like the first 20 pages talking about being the dappled light of the stereo. It's incredibly poetic and I'm ramming in, I'm trying to shove in all this stuff right up front because here's another thing we're going to pick up throughout, The military came in after the cyclone and it was looting and it was blah, 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 and it was all the things were happening. And movement children once again evacuated and you can also see how flat the place is, and you want to see how flat the place is. Nowadays you've got to look at it from the sky, you want to see how flat the place is, and that winding water, that searching for a drop, go side to side, is also potential. So I'm ramming so much in, whereas 20 pages on stereo double line, I'm just like,
Well, but that's a different kind of anxiety than the one that you're saying you're having anxiety about.
Yeah, no, but I do read some of this and think, oh my God, it's that preachy kind of voice rather than a lyrical sort of readerly voice.
So whatever, all history is political.
Yeah.
Whatever you leave out, like that article by the forest people, is very political by not telling those stories. So it's not a question of to be political or not be political.
That's true. That's right. It's true.
Matt?
Thank you very much. It was great to be here to listen to. I was interested in that notion of strategic forgetting that you talked about, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little, and I think that it's clearly happening in the Northern Territory. I think it probably happens in Australia, but I think it has a particular flavour here in the North. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how that as an experience of growing up. So how did you learn to do strategic kinds of forgetting or not talkings as you grew up? And then, I'd be interested in if you could reflect on how a place like NTU and CDU and possibly now Sydney University offer you a chance to undo some of that strategic forgetting that actually you argue seems to help a place to go along and just sort of do its work.
Roger, that's a big question. Okay,
Tess, I was just going to say I was fascinated for your book to come out because I lived out in Kakadu for 20 years and partly Jabiru, partly Ranger Station, and up at Coburg, and the strategic myopia out there is amazing between JME, the mine, the national park, the Office of Civilising Scientists, and I was just really fascinated to see how you describe the strategic myopia that exists in Darwin. So just to add to
That's a standout example, Catherine, because you know uranium mining. So why was there a market for uranium? What was Australia involved in that time? Where was it going? What was it doing? What kind of massive geopolitical kind of set of horizons was that completely? By giving you this little enclave, but you'll have a big pit here, which is. And we'll pretend that doesn't exist and has no ramifications. It was just bizarre. But yeah, the way that's been covered over time. Chris Haynes' PhD is a brief analysis of that.
Yes,
So growing up here, I wasn't really conscious of how multiracial we were until after the cyclone. So being evacuated and forced into an army barracks at first. Actually, I really enjoyed that. I was taught wrong. I was given so much ice cream and jelly and beer there, so it was unbelievable. It was fantastic.
And how many?
By these really nice soldiers.
And how old were you?
I was 8.
8.
So then I go to school, and in Brisbane, in this a school that actually exists. It's called Humpy Bong. I used to think that I'd made up. Now I looked it up. No, it exists. It's in this, inner city somewhere. It's sort of one of the elite area. And I was a refugee, so I was treated nicely. But we had to wear shoes. That was different, and we were all white. And I remember realising it. I remember realising that there were no Greeks, there were no Vietnamese, there were no there were no Italians, there were no Aboriginal kids, there were no Filipino kids, there was no Chinese kids, there was just nothing. I felt so heartbroken and homesick, desperately so. Not for any ethical reason, I just was not. This was far too much performance of being good white that I had no background in. A form of intimidation I experienced again when I first went to university. University of Western Australia, and I was straight from here, Darwin High School, blah, blah. I went to a private college on the campus grounds, University of Western Australia. I lasted 6 weeks because it was really a place for elite. These were kids of pastoral properties. Some of them had been given, Jaguars for passing the Year 12 exams. It was known and it mattered that I went to a public school. I'm coming from an environment where none of this shit, it really did not matter. So I had with those intimidations of being with elite whites, rich white people who are kind of entitled and know how to operate. Like they know how to dress, and they know how to buy. They know how to be affluent. These were skills that I actually didn't have, and not with a sense of bravado and pride, which I might have now. I felt completely the country bumpkin in every cliche way possible. So my homesickness wasn't about, we have this wonderful town, multiculturalism. My homesickness was about, this is too scary a performance environment for me. I can't cope, I don't match, I don't relate, I don't have the proper shoes, and for these kids it matters. So I came back with an awareness then of the kids, and now I have strong memories of all the humiliations that we didn't protest. So I can remember distinctly an Aboriginal man, Fabian Hasbane, a local family, who brought in magpie beef satay for his offering to the Christmas, thing, where we're all meant to bring fairy bread and stuff. And our teacher, who was from Singapore, saying that we did not have this kind of I can't remember what he said, but it was pretty much, tribal rubbish here.
He sang it?
He said it.
And said. Sorry.
Tipped the satays into the bin. And I remember we all looked at that with that sense of, holy fuck, jeopardy, but not protesting, not articulating, not sending any signals about it, just aware of the moment. So those sort of things were here all the time. They were here all the time. It was crazy from that point of view. And then as a teenager you become more aware. The CLP are now in power. We've had self-governance, CLP come in. and every single land rights case has been contested. You know, I can remember writing a letter to Bob Hall, congratulating him for handing back Uluru and standing up so But here, what's interesting to me about that, so we were really aware of all the groups, we were aware of all the patches. You took your life on your hand on the school bus. I lived in Ludmilla, which was completely mixed race. I had put a whole lot of working class and public housing. In fact, it turns out I learned later it was all Aboriginal land and it was appropriated.
Yeah,
you know, so we didn't kind of know that. But
it's all part of Bagot.
Yeah, it was all part of Bagot. So we were living in that and being bashed up and by these Aboriginal kids all the time. That was just how the gangs worked. And so I was a tough kid. I became a tough kid. I became the girl you had to get past to go to the toilet.
Still that.
No, I'm really.
Well, you know, it's interesting because
I used to flick cigarettes at the girls.
But what is there a way in which, not in the book, but like you yourself think about the strategic forgetting? Because I grew up in the South in the U.S.
Yeah.
So we went down there when I was 63. So through integration, and you could, what white Southerners would say, Northerners, was that that the intimacy between the groups, and African Americans and whites primarily, was very different, and it allowed for all sorts of other arrangements. And it was segregated, but not like in the North. So they, if you were white in the South, then all this apologies, the formations of apology is really interesting.
Yeah.
But what would be the difference between, say, the form of strategic forgetting, say, up here, and the form of strategic forgetting down there? You have the national difference, obviously. You have all sorts of regional differences. But I think that would be also really interesting.
I think there's
what's the
regional
function
differences, because I did my first fieldwork in Warrana, and I thought I knew a thing or two about divided racial towns. I remember being refused service because I'd been speaking to an Aboriginal person on the island outside the milk bar sort of thing. And being quite shocked by that level of really explicit, brazen kind of hostilities, which here made me realise that there was these layers and that the intimacies would be claimed. That you don't know what we know, which is, I think, I call it somewhere else, that we have this agar plate, which is the culturing of us and them takes place. And that agar plate, the jelly, is one which is also a racialised compound. And part of it, this kind of the different admixes, the different intimacies on the football field, The football is this incredibly divided thing. It's white and black, it's white and coloured for a long time. And how it's remembered is as the levelling field, as the thing that kind of refused the categories and was where, and like the war. The war is remembered very fondly as the time when Aboriginal people were liberated because they were paid properly and they were given these jobs. Whereas in fact,
doesn't that mean that like talking about going to Perth, talking about going to Brewarrina, it seems to me as though what you're telling a story about how the other places are much more strategically myopic than what you were brought up with. Is actually
they're different, aren't they? They're different. They're different. Because what I'm interested in here now is the way, there are these really strong representations of Darwin's multiculturalism, and its harmony, its multicultural harmony, and I think the strategic forgetting, by the way, and suppressions are at multiple levels. Like I don't just see it in racial terms. And I think that the militarisation of the place it requires that we don't ask too many questions either.
That leads me to my question, to get off that thing back, but maybe onto style a little bit more and myopia. You talked about the geo and the eco, and and also about ficto-criticism. How do you actually get the geo and the eco and the history and the global capitalism all to work at the same time as you're writing? And does fictionalising real events help you to do that? Or
are you fictionalizing?
Not really. Like, I thought I would try. And the only place that I've actually fictionalised anybody is with, I've got this, what I call composite girls. I just give them names, but they're in fact the amalgam of several girls. And that's because they're telling me such kind of direct stories that about the sectoral topography of Darwin, which bars you go to if you want an AJ for a sex with no commitment, which ones do you go to if you're looking for a potential long-term relationship, Like, they've got this whole scene. So I have these amalgamations there, and I kind of fictionalise a little bit. But otherwise, what I have found myself doing is just trying to use fictional techniques to re-enter places. So to sort of bring it to like, if I see, so an example would be, I read about Gilruth. Gilruth was described by multiple people on the day that, he was the one that was ousted, the administrator that was booted off.
he's got
You're looking blank at me. This guy was an administrator, there was rebellion, it's called the Darwin Rebellion, and pretty much he was put back on the ship and away. Okay, they hated him for all sorts of reasons, and the vestices come into that story too. Gilruth, the description of him having this showdown with these militant unionists, or about 1,000 of them, which would have been, half the population at the time, this confrontation at Government House. People describe him looking tired, sounding tired, his voice is tired, and that's part of the problem. No one can hear him. So they press forward to hear the guy and then crush the fence down, and that's seen as this rampage, and so it's all beaten up. Anyway, it's just kind of sort of a comedy of errors. But I tried to imagine this guy who for months now knows that he's hated. He's gone to the point where he's grabbed some civil servants and public servants and said, Matt, you'll do. You got to wear a revolver now, and you're going to be my bodyguard. And they're like, what? They're going to potentially have to shoot their friends. Like, how does this actually work? So, and the locals were looking at that, thinking, what the fuck? Everyone's getting really outraged and angry. So he's dealing with this month in, month out. So the description's going to be tired. So I try and say something like, so he confronts this crowd, his face aching with fatigue. Because I'm trying to imagine what's that moment like for him. Those are the fictional techniques that I'm keeping an eye on more than anything. So just to try and
this is it. You know this. There was a big debate in history coming out of in large part out of France about how to, and a lot of from the perspective of the unwritten history, what's the line past which one can go from archival sources to historical description. A very famous case of being that was made into a movie, The Return of Martin Gere.
Oh yeah.
And the use of, say, various kinds of theories, psychoanalytic theory, feminist theory, cultural theory, to put various kinds of affects or subjectivities into the head of historical characters that aren't actually described in the documents themselves. Whatever, I forget what her name is, who wrote The Return of Martin Gere. I mean, it set off in a debate. To say, well, if we assume gender relations X, if we assume Y, then I can actually attribute a certain kind of internal subjectivity, which manifests as certain kinds of intimacies, and etc., to these historical characters. And then other more conservative historians saying, this is fiction.
Yeah.
This is absolutely crossed my mind. So in some ways, I mean, what this book is really interesting. Is it a history? And thus are you reading and involved in really interesting debates that emerged in historical studies of the history discipline? Is it a memoir?
Yeah.
At which point, you know, what's a memoir, what's a history, that becomes quite interesting debates right now. Is it a tourist book? Like, you know, is it one of these? Is it kind of photo? Yeah. Is it written in, you know, Benvenistian eye, but it's really a photo guide to Darwin?
Yeah. I started writing a little, because that one part that's allowed to me is a forward. So I've said this is not a place that you would have visitable sites. It's not oh yes, I can see that. The jail.
Take the number 4 bus.
Yeah.
Are the other ones illustrated?
No.
Are they more like tourist books?
God, that's so frustrating. I've had so many people say, I've got a box of, and then, you know, they show you this sort of photographs or mementos or all sorts of amazing things out there that you could do so much with. But thus far, no, they don't have illustrations.
But are they memoirs? Are they history?
They are these blurry things.
They're blurry.
They're blurry, yeah.
That can be a next book.
Blurry things.
The photos.
No.
Photos, yeah. Yeah, oh yeah, there's some great stuff. But, so I have been reading, like, I found it quite useful. Do you know Geraldine Brooks, who's a... So she wrote, she's written a few beautiful novels. She's Australian. She's Aussie. She doesn't think that she's Aussie. Yeah, she lives in a... She's
I never heard her.
She's got a weird accent.
Caleb's Crossing.
Yeah, Caleb's
she's
Crossing.
novelist.
So for Caleb's Crossing, she had to try and imagine what women sounded like, because a lot of her narratives really give voice to, you know, people who she's imagining. And she couldn't find in the archives any women's voices, because lo and behold, all those Puritan women, they were encouraged to learn how to read, but not to write, because writing was very unseemly, and it was sort of, you know, might lead to some bad things. So they don't have diaries, and they don't have, you know, journals and all this sort of stuff that you can get in How Were Men Thinking, which is her normal sort of source to try and get voices in her head. She needs to get that schizophrenia where they start talking to her and then she can start channeling and bring to life these things. No women's voices. And where she found them was very similar to the Gavin, that's why I'm thinking of it. She finds them in courts. So where women are being prosecuted and having to defend themselves for all sorts of bizarre accusations about whether they were wearing an apron or only that day or whatever, and someone's recorded what they're saying, and so it's sort of still second party, but it's very much closer to what was going on for those women and the tone of voice that they've been using, the sorts of phrases they've been using, the obsessions that they had, including the religious ones and the anxieties that they had, so that she could try and represent them. So I thought that was really interesting too. Like, I have not had time with this, but I was thinking of those missing voices. What did our kid think? Da da da. Like, there would be ways. And I have said this to you, that what's really interesting, once you realise just how dense and storied the histories here are, both horizontally and vertically, how little has been made of it. You know, that for all the dozens of histories that are available, how lacking they are. So the ficto-criticism thing, I'm just playing with, but I think there's so much potential. Even just trying to put this together, I discovered even more about my bloody haunting with Hugh Wason Byers. To finish off, if you want to see his name appear in yet another unexpected spot, go into the Star Village in town off the mall, and to the side, where they have the winners of the Tamaris Cup, the first inaugural winner is no other than. I walked in there one day, what is this guy?
They're real force stuff.
Okay, thanks for that, Tess. Any other quick comments or questions? Okay, thank you again. And to tomorrow afternoon we have the third in our series where Beth is going to be talking again about the local and the great sweep of histories and their stories of deontologies, belonging, being and obligating as forms of truth making. So there'll be something from her experience and from our experience, and we're very much looking forward to that third of our talks.
There is a weird thread.
There will be a weird
There will be brought around all the way through tomorrow.